Alright, so it's been exactly 2 weeks for Edge of Eternities, and I wanted to do a quick video on the current metagame because I'm sure a lot of people are wondering like what to craft and whatnot, and just kind of waiting at the moment to craft a deck. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's get right into it. So currently, the safest to craft, in my honest opinion, even though a lot of people are going to hate this, but it is actually the Bant Show and Tell at the moment. So this is the new show and tell list from Novos that spawned as a result of some of the new additions to the format from Age of Eternities, such as these two cards here. We have the Ancient Tomb, and well, it's not in the deck, but there's also Stripmine as well. Compared to the Sultai list, Stripmine has done some considerable damage to the show and tell list, and we actually kind of saw the result of it in the tournament recently, where a number of people actually showed up with the Sultai show and tell list that was playing this card, Assemble the Team. Now, Assemble the Team is a very, very broken card, in my opinion. So the list before could play like 5 tutor effects, 4 copies of Assembled Team, plus they could also play Demonic Tutor as well. Obviously, the effects of the Stripmine is going to make the Assembled Team a lot worse as a result, but they also play cards like Rakshas's Bargain, which isn't really making full use of the Ancient Tomb either. So as a result, we have the Bant version here. Going into Bant allows the deck to stop relying on tutor spells and rather take advantage of the Ancient Tomb over here. So you can cast our 3 mana cards on turn 1 or 2 easier. Of course, casting Show and Tell on turn 1 is possibly the best thing you can do, but the chances of you actually having this combo on turn 1 is actually about 0.3% or less. Like, for you to have Ancient Tomb, Show and Tell, a Chrome Mox, and having a Waterlock Teaching and Omniscience at the same time. Plus, you would need additional card to put it under the Chrome Mox, right? And not to mention this, we're only playing 3 copies of Chrome Moxes instead of 4. So the chance of you actually having a turn 1 Show and Tell into a combo is fairly low. So you can basically just count out on that. And basically this calculation was done by ChatGPT in my other show and tell video during one of the match. And of course, I also had another commenter there showing their work, saying that it is in fact fairly low to get that combo on turn 1. But even without the show and tell on turn 1, another card that you can cast with the help of the Ancient Tomb is actually this card, Stock Up, which is going to be one of our primary way of digging through our combo here. And what's actually so sneaky about the Ancient Tomb is, personally, having played about 30 games with the deck, I ended up with a 25 and 5 score playing this list, and the Ancient Tomb edition actually allows you to hardcast some of our big cards, such as our 7 drops, fairly often than you'd think. So we have the Hullbreaker Horror and a Troxa here, which is actually so very sneaky because a lot of the times you can hold on to your Chrome Moxes and surprise your opponent by putting an Ancient Tomb down at the end with the Chrome Mox. And even though they clearly have some hate pieces around on the battlefield that's pressuring our show and tell combo, sometimes just putting down a threat onto the battlefield is enough to win the game as well. Not to mention, the white splash makes it so that against like aggro, fairly resilient, because now we have 4 copies of Swords of Plowshare, and we also have some Fragment Reality, which can both answer threats and getting rid of opponents' hate pieces as well. Or, if opponent's playing some random reanimate deck going around, which is actually the next deck that we're going to be talking about here, a lot better in those kind of matchups. So the next deck we're going to be talking about here is this deck called the Slot Machine, but it's actually just a reanimate show and tell deck. I'm guessing the naming scheme is to kind of, tell you how much you have to mulligan into trying to get a big creature out on turn 1. And in my honest opinion, I don't think this is actually a good craft at the moment. A best of 1, sure, maybe, but some decks in best of 1 are just winning on turn 1. And the thing is, this deck doesn't technically win on turn 1, and even if you get a big creature down, you could be expecting to win maybe in 3 turns as well. So even in best of 1, a little bit dicey, but in best of 3, there's so many hate pieces going around at the moment that makes this deck not a very good choice at the moment. And not to mention the deck we just talked about, Bant Show and Tell as well, right? Show and Tell deck is really good, and I mean, it's probably the best deck at the moment. And if you're playing a deck like this that's putting a big creature down on the battlefield, not only can they just play a Source of Plowshare on this card on one of your big creatures that you just played on turn 1, but because you're also playing a Show and Tell main deck in this list, it now becomes completely useless because it's honestly pretty scary to run it out on turn 1, especially if you don't know what your opponent's playing and you don't have a turn 1 grief as well. What if your opponent just puts down an Omniscience on turn 1 and win the game on the spot because you just played a Show and Tell? Things like that. And speaking of a Source of Plowshare, oh man, there are way too many decks right now going around in the ladder that is playing Source of Plowshare in the main deck, which honestly doesn't help this deck's case either. But I think the card that really hurts the deck right now actually is this card, Containment Priest. This card is in every white deck at the moment as a 3 or 4 up in the sideboard, and that is including Bant Show and Tell as well. So although the deck was really strong week 1 of Edge of Eternities, but now that the meta has settled down a little bit, if you've been playing the ladder, you'll see less and less of this deck in particular in the ladder. But even in the tournament, you didn't really see any of the slot machine decks. There was only one person, and they also didn't do quite well with the deck. And that's to be expected because there were a lot of Show and Tell lists, and you're also trying to Show and Tell as well. But again, you're playing down one creature, you know, possibly 2 creatures, but they have a source, things like that. It just doesn't pan out too well. So yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend crafting this deck, because there's just way too many white decks at the moment, and they just have so many hate pieces. And the next deck I actually want to talk about is the Turbo Stripmine deck. So actually, only one person brought a Turbo Stripmine deck, and they actually did pretty well. But when I was looking at their list, I see one problem they had in the deck, and they actually didn't even play the best creature for this type of deck, which is this card here, Wary Zone Guard. However, despite that, they actually went 3-0 versus Show and Tell decks. They beat 2 Sultai Show and Tell, and they beat 1 Bant Show and Tell. But unfortunately, they lost to Stifle Not at Home and Miss Min's Shadow Sacrifice deck. So this deck is actually not that bad versus Show and Tell, it seems. And speaking from experience, this personal list that I have at the moment and on the screen was also very good versus Show and Tell as well. I'm currently 10-1 with the deck, with only losing to one mirror match that was playing Golgari instead of a green-white here that you see. And the reason why I moved away from Golgari is to have some tax creatures for combo matchups such as the Archon and the Anointed Peacekeeper. Just getting it down with our Ancient Tomb here on turn 1 or 2 is just so good. Plus, you also have a very good removal spells such as the Source of Plowshare and, of course, the sideboard as well. You have access to the Containment Priest, which is very good against the slot machine deck again. So I think the Turbo Stripmine list is actually pretty darn good. And if you're actually going to craft this, you might want to consider maybe like 2 copies of Prismatic Ending somehow. A lot of people that have tried this list have been telling me that unless you're pressuring your opponent down with your Stripmines, you could potentially get run over if you don't close out the game fast enough. So it's going to be pretty important to mulligan into your Deathrite Shaman, Chrome Moxes, Stripmines, and Ancient Tomb. I think these are going to be the key pieces into basically accelerating the deck. But I think the most impressive part about this deck is actually running creatures that people usually don't play, like such as the Anointed Peacekeeper, Wary Zone Guard, and of course this is new, so Icetail Explorer. And even the Scythecat Cub. We're playing so many new cards that weren't really viable before, but all thanks to this card and this card here, Ancient Tomb and Stripmine, they suddenly became viable. I think the most impressive card is definitely the Wary Zone Guard. This card is just such a stupid card that makes this deck so much broken than it should be. Like the fact that you get an untapped Stripmine onto the battlefield is just pretty insane. But the fact that, like, why does this grow? Why does this grow, right? I think it's just so ridiculous to me that this card grows, which makes this card pretty insane. Another card that's actually pretty impressive was the Ice Tail Explorer and the Scythe-Cat Cub together. So this is a new card from Edge of Eternities, right? Why this card is extremely powerful is because not only can we get it down pretty early with things like Ancient Tomb, Chrome Moxes, and Deathbright Shaman, but even without the Stripmine in the graveyard, just playing out few fetch lands onto the battlefield is going to start turbo milling your deck into finding your Stripmine, which is the key part that makes this card so good. And at the same time, the synergy between this card and the Scythe-Cat Cub, which makes this card very, very scary. I have won multiple games just running out this card with the Ice Tail Explorer, just pumping +1/+1 counters onto like Anonti Peacekeeper that has Vigilance, or even itself it has Trample, or you can give it to Archon of Bemuria that has Flying. So the card just becomes quite absurd in my opinion in this kind of deck, and you can just end the game as fast as possible if this lands. All right, I think that's enough about that deck. So now let's get into the fun police, which is this deck here called the Mardu Energy. So a lot of people actually speculated, including myself, that this deck will become unplayable with Edge of Eternities. Well, potentially. With the addition of things like Ancient Tomb and Strip Mines and whatnot, it's really hard to play cards like Juggernaut Peddlers and Thoughtseizes when opponents just blowing up your lands with the Strip Mine. But the reality is, even if they do that, because the CMC of this deck is just so low, if you can just kind of forget about these cards and just like, all you need really is just 2 lands ever, this deck just kind of single-handedly kills every other aggro or mid-range decks, which is kind of absurd because not only do they have the most efficient creatures like, Amped Raptors, a Johnny, things like that, but they can win pretty fast with the Goblin Bombardment combo, right? But they also happen to have best removal spells such as the Swords of Plowshare, Galvanic Discharge, and Static Prison. So even though, yes, they did get kind of weaker as a result of the Strip Mine, making their Black Splash a bit awkward at times, but they also kind of do have the Rag Event to fix the mana a bit, and most of their 2-mana cards are only 1 pip color. So having like the best removal spells like Swords of Plowshare, Static Prison, Galvanic Discharge, you can kill Weary Zone guards on sight very easily, so you don't get Strip Mined over and over again. So it does seem pretty good on paper, right? But obviously, this deck is actually considered a B tier deck according to Gathering.gg, and they do the tier list based on the win rate and the usage rate in the ladder using the tracker Untapped. So what exactly is stopping this deck from being the best deck? Well, the thing is, there's a lot of combo decks. That's the thing, that there's a lot of combo decks, and this deck has a very hard time dealing with the combo deck. So that's why you see main deck discard spells, but honestly, discard spells are just a scam. You can't prevent your opponent from just top decking a win. And not to mention, the Bant show and tell lists are also playing things like main deck Veil Summers, which doesn't help this deck either. So you're always on the clock against things like a combo deck, which is honestly kind of the downfall with this deck, in my opinion. It's almost really good because it does, basically kill every other fair decks, but it doesn't get the job done because it can't finish against a combo deck as reliably compared to some other decks out there. And funny enough, the deck that I actually thought was going to kill this deck for good was actually Eldrazi, but where are the Eldrazi's now? Well, honestly, Eldrazi's have kind of disappeared. So honestly, this was kind of outside of the scope of my understanding because having 4 copies of Strip Mine in the format for every single deck is a kind of a crazy concept, We all thought Strip Mine is going to make Eldrazi so broken because they do also have access to the ban card in Legacy, such as Sowing Mycospawn, and now they got how many soul lands now? We got Eldrazi Temple, Ancient Tomb, and you also have access to the Ugin's Lab. So with the Ugin's Lab and the Ancient Tomb, you can potentially just like Chalice of the Void on turn 1 pretty consistently, considering that now they got 2 different soul lands. Well, now the reality kind of sinks in, and we see that Eldrazi's are nowhere to be found. So, what exactly happened? So, ironically, the deck was supposed to become insane with Sowing Mycospawn and, the Strip Mines. But funny thing is, the Strip Mine was actually the card that made Eldrazi's unplayable. Because the Strip Mines were in every other deck, which meant that our soul lands got destroyed pretty easily. And what's the land that, they can destroy? Well, that's this card called Ugin's Lab, which made the Ugin's Lab completely unplayable. This actually impacted the deck's playability quite a bit because we were all speculating Eldrazi's would become an insane deck because we could play out things like a 2-mana spells like very consistently on turn 1, such as Flutes, Stone Brains, Chalices, like Chalice, Disruptor Flutes, right? But because the Ugin's Lab became more or less, unplayable with the how many Strip Mines are in every single deck, and even worse, like now we have like Turbo Strip Mine decks with the Wary Zone Guard. That was also not in our radar either. So Eldrazi's kind of became a little bit unplayable because without the soul lands being strip mined all the time, just playing out like these cards became pretty hard. And not to mention the fact that you can't play Ugin's Lab meant that you can't have a good sideboard. So at the moment, I think the only way for the Eldrazi's to become maybe playable in the future, as of now, maybe potentially if the deck gets like an Eye of Ugin at the point, things like that. But even then, I don't know. Another deck that's kind of underperforming right now is the Red Moon decks. I'm sure if you've been playing in the ladder, you almost never see this deck around anymore, compared to something like a week 1 games you played. Funny enough, although it does have a similar problem to Eldrazi in that they might need another soul land or something, but I actually think the missing part of this deck are the creatures themselves. We just don't have good creatures right now in the format that just says like, hey, if you leave this alone for a turn, you'll die the next turn kind of creatures. So something like Broadside Bombardier, which can do like the turn it comes down, like you have a haste, deal 9 damage with the Fury when it comes down, things like that. Or better yet, if you also have like 1 ring down as well, you could also do an extra 6 damage by sacrificing the 1 ring if you wanted to. Or another creature such as Pyrogoyf that deals a lot of damage to another target. So the biggest problem at the moment with this deck is not only are we missing a way to end the game fast enough because we are technically racing against our own clock because this deck plays Ancient Tomb and it's also playing 1 ring as well, but the ability to kind of kill off some big creatures that comes down is what's completely lacking at the moment if you're in mono red. Like for example, Psychic Frog comes to mind, or even like some of the like the Sorin decks, putting an Elenda down, or just reanimating a creature onto the battlefield is actually kind of enough to win the game on its own against this deck. Like I said, it's just we have no way of killing the big creatures. Some of the recommendations you could potentially see yourself playing is like Goblin Rabble Master. But the problem with this card is that your goblins have to attack every single turn, which means if opponent has something like a Johnny, that Johnny is gonna transform immediately, which is not ideal. So definitely the Mono Red Prison, maybe I'm missing something, maybe there's something good you can do with this deck, but the fact that like it kind of lacks the ability to kill your opponent fast enough, paired up with the fact that like the interactions with this deck is a little bit lacking, I would probably stay away from this deck if I were you. Right, so now we have the tokens list. We got various versions here. We have the Mono White, Selesnya, and Azorius that we're going to be talking about. But basically, this version that you see, Mono White version, is a pretty straightforward deck that is trying to abuse the Ancient Tomb so that we can get the Contel and then paying the Offspring cost for our Exalted Sunborn, or even any other creatures that you see. Because if you do get the Exalted Sunborn Offspring with the Caretaker, the Ocelot Pride tokens that you generate at the end of the turn becomes absolutely nuts. I've had instances where I've generated like 72 cat tokens in a single turn, which is kind of insane. I did have a pretty good result with the deck in the ladder, but I did actually feel that the Exalted Sunborn, although it's really, really cool, I felt that this card was a bit clunky overall and had some trouble getting to the combo because, our Ancient Tomb was getting strip mined. But obviously when the combo popped off, I won immediately because it is actually pretty insane if you make like exponential number of tokens, which is also really fun at the same time. So not only does the deck have some, that the fun factor, the deck is also pretty decent. But again, I did kind of feel that the Exalted Sunborn was a bit clunky, so we kind of move on to the Selesnya list, which tries to solve that problem. So the list I tried is basically kind of the same list as the mono white list, except with a little bit of a twist. Now we see Birthing Ritual to cheat out our big stuff, since you could actually abuse warp cards with this card, making it pretty effective in cheating out like 5 mana cards, because the warp kind of stays on the battlefield, and at the end of the turn, before this sacrifice goes off, you actually sacrifice to the Birthing Ritual instead. So this way, even though Exalted Sunborn was a bit clunky in that mono white list, you can warp this card from hand and sacrifice the ritual to get a little bit more value out of it instead of just kind of rotting in your hand compared to the mono white list, which definitely felt a lot better. One of the stronger things that you can do with this deck compared to the mono white list is obviously the fact that we have a Stripmine in the deck, but it's the fact that we actually have a Renegade Rallier in the deck that you can, Birthing Ritual into to grab a Stripmine at the end of the turn to blow up another land. So you Stripmine, sacrifice a 2-mana card into a Rallier, and then Stripmine again, which is fairly powerful against something like a combo deck. But again, there's another problem with the deck, and even though like the deck does perform pretty well against a lot of the decks, but if you do meet an energy deck, it is actually just impossible to win, because once the Goblin Bombardment is down, all the offspring creatures, because the offspring creatures are indeed 1/1 copies of it, plus, Offset Pride being a 1/1 as well, everything just kind of dies if they resolve a Goblin Bombardment, which was, kind of a sad tale. So do kind of keep that in mind if you're thinking about crafting either the mono white or the Selesnya. But contrary to the 2 tokens list that I just talked about, the blue-white version of this deck has been doing a lot of work. Well, this deck isn't like entirely focused on tokens, so I'm just gonna call it like blue-white warp for now. And this is another deck that's been doing pretty well, actually. And the energy matchup, can be a little bit tough, but having more removal spells and even like, Ephemerate makes the matchup a little bit bearable. And not to mention, like, we have like bigger creatures like Quantum Riddler, and that's a lot harder to kill compared to something like the tokens list with a lot of, 1 or 2 toughness creatures. And speaking of Quantum Riddler, this card actually has been such a sick card, because this card not only lets you draw more cards when you have like 1 or less, like when this card comes down, but it's not just on cards that draw, but even at the upkeep, if you like draw a card during upkeep when you only have like 1 or less cards in hand, this can draw you an additional card, which is actually pretty cool. So I definitely recommend this one. I think this deck is actually pretty cool. And now we move on to the Belcher. This is actually Mistman's list who won the tournament, but I actually don't recommend crafting a Belcher deck at the moment. So Belcher decks have gone absolutely nothing in this update with Edge of Eternities, and although they are still viable, and you can definitely win games with this deck, as you've seen, Mistman winning the tournament, but they have actually gotten considerably worse with every other deck being faster now with the Ancient Tomb. The fact that every deck also has access to, strip mines as well doesn't help Belcher's case either. And especially in the latter compared to the tournament, there's going to be a lot more like turbo strip mine decks, right? And there's also just way too many like hate cards going around. Every deck basically has like 3 to 4 flutes in the sideboard. And again, like compared to the tournament where only 1 deck had Archon of Memoria, a lot of decks in the latter are going to have a lot more Archons, not only in the sideboard, but even main deck as well. And this is going to basically slow down like Dark Ritual, Sacrifice, shenanigans. Yeah, I definitely don't recommend it too much, but I can't really stop you if you are a Belcher enjoyer. I'm just going to leave it at that. So yeah, I think that about sums up all the decks I wanted to talk about. There's some other decks I haven't mentioned, but that's because I haven't really played with them yet with the new cards. I think the meta is actually still incredibly fresh, although we're going to see a lot more meta decks popping around, especially because of the result of the tournament. And I've definitely felt that in the ladder a little bit. There's a lot of show and tells at the moment, but there's so many cards that we have yet to like experiment still. I can already kind of like name a bunch like Affinity with the new Warp card and the Ancient Tomb, or something like a potentially like a Humans list with the Worry Zone Guard, a Sneak Attack deck with like Magus and stuff, like maybe, or maybe like Ancient Tomb Goblins. There's also like Mono White Control with the Ancient Tomb and Stripmine, Frogless with like Stifle, and honestly, like the list goes on. So, pretty excited about Timeless still, but Historic on the other hand, well, it's apparently all Eldrazi's.